That's a critical piece of the prosecution's case right there, you guys. If it's called a dying declaration, it comes into court, even though it's hearsay because it's an out-of-court statement by someone. But a dying declaration comes in over hearsay objection. So if Romy Reiner is actually going to take the stand and repeat that her mother told her as she lay dying that it was Romy's brother, Nick, oh my God.
I once asked Nick a question that still echoes in my mind. What could his father have done differently? What more could Rob Reiner have done to save his family? Nick didn't have an answer. Not over dinner. Not later. Maybe not ever. And maybe that silence says more than words ever could. Sometimes, even when love is endless and effort is genuine, there are forces far beyond a parent's control. That truth sits at the heart of this devastating story. Nearly 3 weeks have passed since the tragic incident involving Rob Reiner and his wife sent shockwaves through Hollywood and beyond. Headlines focused on the shock and disbelief, but the real story lives beneath the surface. When you strip away the fame, the wealth, and the public image, what's left is a family that had been quietly unraveling for years. This wasn't a single moment of chaos. It was the final chapter of a long, painful struggle that few people truly understood. One detail that has been widely misunderstood from the beginning is who actually made the emergency call that day. Contrary to early reports, it was not Rob and Michelle Reiner's daughter, Romy, who called 911. When Romy entered the house, her world collapsed instantly. The shock was so intense that her body froze. She couldn't speak. She couldn't think. She collapsed under the weight of what she had just seen. The call for help was made by the person who entered the house with her, and that detail would later become critically important. The chain of events began on a quiet Sunday afternoon, December 14th, 2025. A massage therapist arrived at the Reiner residence in Brentwood for their usual weekly appointment. Rob and Michelle never missed these sessions. They were routine, predictable, almost comforting. But this time, no one answered the door. There were no footsteps, no voices, no movement behind the pristine white gates, just silence. A silence that felt wrong. After repeated knocking and unanswered calls to both Rob and Michelle, concern quickly turned into panic. The therapist reached out to their daughter, Romy Reiner, who lived only a few minutes away. That unnatural quiet was the first warning sign. Romy didn't hesitate. She rushed over, assuming there had been a misunderstanding or missed call. She had no way of knowing that what awaited her would permanently divide her life into before and after. When Romy opened the front door, she wasn't afraid at first, just uneasy. But the moment her eyes landed on what was inside, time seemed to stop. Her father, Rob Reiner, was lying motionless. There is no human way to prepare for a sight like that. Her mind couldn't comprehend it. She screamed, panicked, and ran back out of the house, her body reacting before her thoughts could catch up. At that moment, she didn't even know her mother was gone as well. Despite what many people believe, Romy was not the one who dialed 911. She wasn't alone when she entered the house. With her was a close male friend named Alex Silberg, someone deeply involved in her personal and creative life. He was the one who made the emergency call moments after stepping inside. This detail matters because trauma doesn't follow logic. When the human brain encounters something unbearable, it often shuts down completely. Freezing, screaming, or running are not signs of guilt. They are signs of shock. Early reports also incorrectly stated that Romy discovered both of her parents at the same time. That isn't true. She only saw her father. The devastating news about her mother came later, after police had already arrived. That means Romy experienced 2 life-altering shocks back-to-back, without even a moment to process the first. It's difficult to imagine the emotional weight of that realization. Alex Silberg's presence that day became crucial in more ways than one. He wasn't just a bystander. He was Romy's creative partner, someone she trusted deeply. They had worked closely together on a short film project, traveled together, and shared years of collaboration. Whether their relationship was purely professional or something more was never publicly confirmed, but what was clear was the trust between them. In cases like this, the person who arrives first and witnesses the scene often becomes a person of interest, not out of suspicion, but procedure. Romy lived nearby. She was the first family member on scene. These facts alone were enough to raise questions. Alex's testimony helped establish the timeline, her actions, and her emotional state. He confirmed that Romy never wandered aimlessly, never acted suspiciously, and never made accusations. His presence played a key role in quickly clearing her of any suspicion. Despite this, rumors began spreading almost immediately. Some online chatter falsely claimed that Romy had accused her brother Nick. That simply wasn't true. From the very beginning, she never pointed fingers. When police arrived, she calmly explained the family's living arrangements, noting that Nick lived on the property. It wasn't an accusation, it was context. Later, major outlets confirmed that Romy never told police to investigate her brother. The rumors were the result of panic, fragmented reporting, and speculations spreading faster than facts. As investigators continued their work, Nick was located and arrested later that evening near Exposition Park in Los Angeles. For Romy, this created an entirely new layer of grief. She wasn't just mourning the loss of her parents. She was facing the horrifying possibility that her own brother might be responsible. From that day forward, she carried two forms of pain that could never be separated. While Romy tried to keep moving, staying active and holding on to work as a way to survive, Nick seemed to drift further into isolation. He wasn't working consistently and appeared disconnected from any stable support system. Two siblings raised in the same home, responding to the same tragedy in completely different ways. From the outside, the Reiner mansion looked peaceful, luxurious, and secure. But behind those gates, tension had been building for years. Police records show multiple visits to the home dating back over a decade, including welfare checks, noise complaints, and mental health emergencies. The most serious incident occurred in 2017 when a domestic violence report was filed. Although details were never made public, it marked a clear turning point. Nick didn't live in the main house. He stayed in a separate guest home on the property. His parents supported him financially, providing roughly $10,000 per month, along with food, housing, and constant care. Friends say Nick entered rehab at least 18 times and had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. Despite all of this, no one close to the family ever described him as violent. The home was known for warmth, forgiveness, and endless second chances. Just 3 months before the tragedy, the entire family appeared together at a red carpet premiere. They smiled, posed for photos, and looked like the perfect Hollywood family. But behind those smiles, Rob and Michelle were deeply worried. In the final weeks, they confided to close friends that they were afraid of their son and didn't feel safe leaving him alone. That fear explains why they brought Nick with them to Conan, O'Brien's Christmas party. That night, Nick appeared distant, pale, and disconnected. He wandered the room asking guests the same unsettling question over and over. "Are you famous?" The tension was undeniable. Eventually, the family left early. That was the last time Rob and Michelle were ever seen in public. This story isn't only about Nick's struggles. Romy later revealed that she herself had battled addiction and depression. She spoke openly about anxiety, nightmares, and emotional darkness. Through her healing journey, she realized something heartbreaking. Her father had lived with lifelong depression as well. Some things, she said, aren't inherited through blood. They're inherited through silence. Now the legal case continues. Nick is being represented by high-profile attorney Alan Jackson, and a not guilty by reason of insanity defense is expected. If successful, Nick could spend his life in a psychiatric facility rather than prison. The next court date is January 7th, a moment that could determine how this story ends. At its core, this tragedy leaves behind painful questions. Where is the line between love and enabling? How many warnings were missed? And how many families are quietly fighting similar battles right now? Rob Reiner was more than a filmmaker. He was a father who loved deeply. And this story reminds us that behind fame and fortune are people carrying invisible pain. As the investigation moved forward, the focus shifted from shock to understanding. Investigators began piecing together not just what happened that day, but the years that led up to it. Every police report, every welfare check, every late-night disturbance suddenly formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. What once seemed like isolated incidents now looked like warnings that had been quietly piling up, waiting for someone to see the full picture. Friends close to the family later revealed that Rob Reiner had been struggling emotionally in the months before the tragedy. Despite his public success and warm personality, he had privately confided fears about the safety of his household. He worried not only about Nick, but about what might happen if things continued the way they were. He loved his son deeply, but that love was mixed with exhaustion, fear, and helplessness, emotions no parent ever wants to admit out loud. Michelle Reiner carried her own silent burden. Those closest to her described her as the emotional anchor of the family, constantly trying to keep peace, smooth tensions, and protect everyone at once. She managed schedules, treatments, and conversations, often placing her own well-being last. Over time, that constant emotional labor takes a toll. When you're always holding things together, you rarely have space to fall apart yourself. Nick's mental health struggles were not sudden. They were years in the making. Schizophrenia is a complex illness, one that can distort reality, blur judgment, and create intense internal chaos. Combined with long-term substance abuse, the effects can be devastating. Sources confirmed that Nick had struggled with heroin, cocaine, and meth for years, often cycling between sobriety and relapse. Each time, his parents stepped in again, hoping this attempt at recovery would finally be the one that worked. In the weeks leading up to December 14th, something critical changed. Nick's doctors adjusted his medication, including his antipsychotic prescription. The goal was stability, but instead, people around him noticed a sharp shift. His moods became more volatile. His behavior grew more unpredictable. Moments of clarity were followed by deep disconnection. Rob and Michelle felt like they were walking on glass, unsure which version of their son they would encounter each day. For families dealing with severe mental illness, this is one of the cruelest realities. You can do everything right and still feel like you're losing control. You follow medical advice, you pay for treatment, you offer unconditional love, and yet the outcome remains uncertain. The Reiners were not negligent or careless. They were parents trapped in an impossible situation, choosing compassion over boundaries again and again. As news of the tragedy spread, public reaction was intense. Social media quickly turned into a courtroom of opinions. Some expressed sympathy, others demanded answers. A few rushed to judgment. This is often how these stories unfold. Pain becomes content, grief becomes speculation, and real people are reduced to headlines and hashtags. What often gets lost is the human cost of that scrutiny. Romy found herself under a microscope at the worst possible moment of her life. Every word she spoke, every pause, every expression was analyzed and misinterpreted. People forgot that she had just lost both parents in a single day. They forgot that shock doesn't look neat or rational. They forgot that trauma doesn't come with a script. Behind the scenes, Romy leaned heavily on the few people she trusted, including Alex. He wasn't just a witness that day, he became part of her emotional survival. In moments like these, it's not about who has the right words, it's about who stays, who sits in the silence, who doesn't ask you to explain your pain. Meanwhile, Nick's legal battle began to take shape. His attorney, Alan Jackson, is known for handling some of the most complex and controversial cases in the country. A not guilty by reason of insanity defense is rare and difficult to win, especially in California. It requires proving that at the time of the act, the defendant could not understand what they were doing or distinguish right from wrong due to mental illness. In Nick's case, the defense is built on years of documented psychiatric treatment, a schizophrenia diagnosis, multiple rehab attempts, and a recent medication change. His parents had reportedly been spending up to $70,000 per month on his care at one point, a staggering amount that reflects just how desperately they were trying to help him. But even with all that evidence, success is far from guaranteed. Prosecutors may argue that Nick's long-term drug use complicates the picture, potentially weakening an insanity defense. Substance abuse can blur the line between illness and choice in the eyes of the law, even when the two are deeply intertwined. The outcome could range from lifelong psychiatric care to a reduced sentence or even a prison term. For now, the case remains delayed pending further evaluations. Beyond the courtroom, this tragedy raises uncomfortable but necessary questions. How does society support families dealing with severe mental illness? Where is the line between compassion and enabling? At what point does love, when left unchecked, become dangerous? These are questions with no easy answers, but they matter more now than ever. The Reiner story also exposes the myth that wealth and fame protect people from suffering. Money can buy treatment, privacy, and comfort, but it cannot cure mental illness. It cannot erase trauma, and it cannot guarantee safety. Pain does not discriminate. It moves quietly through every social class, often hiding behind smiles and success. Rob Reiner spent his life telling stories about humanity, empathy, and moral complexity. In a tragic twist, his own life became a story that forces us to confront those same themes in the real world. He believed deeply in understanding people, even at their worst. Perhaps that belief guided him as a father, loving without limits, even when the cost became unbearable. As this case continues to unfold, one thing remains painfully clear. This was not a story of neglect or malice. It was a story of love stretched beyond its limits, of mental illness left unchecked by systems that struggle to intervene effectively, and of a family that tried again and again to save one of its own. And maybe that's why this story resonates so deeply, because so many families see pieces of themselves in it. The late-night worries, the second chances, the fear of saying the wrong thing or doing too much or not enough, the hope that tomorrow will be better, even when yesterday wasn't. This isn't just a Hollywood tragedy. It's a human one. And it reminds us that behind every breaking news alert is a family forever changed. If there's one thing to take away from this story, it's that mental health struggles don't end in isolation. They ripple outward, affecting everyone who loves the person at the center of the storm. As we wait for the next court date and more answers, this story is far from over. There are still unanswered questions, emotional truths, and systemic failures that deserve careful attention, not judgment, not speculation, but understanding. As the days passed, grief began to settle into something heavier and more complicated. Shock fades, but questions don't. For those closest to the Reiner family, the tragedy forced an uncomfortable reckoning with the past. Moments that once felt ordinary were suddenly replayed with new meaning. Every argument, every late-night call, every uneasy silence now carried the weight of hindsight. And hindsight, as always, is unforgiving. Mental health professionals who followed the case pointed out a painful truth many families face. Severe mental illness doesn't exist in a straight line. There are good stretches that create hope, followed by sudden collapses that erase it overnight. That unpredictability is what makes it so dangerous. Families cling to progress, even when warning signs quietly return. The Reiners were no different. They believed in recovery because they had seen it before. What they couldn't predict was how fast everything could unravel again. One of the most haunting aspects of this story is how isolated families become when dealing with mental illness at this level. Despite wealth, access to care, and professional help, Rob and Michelle were still navigating a system filled with gaps. Doctors treat symptoms. Rehab treats addiction. The legal system responds after damage is done. But families are often left in between, trying to hold everything together without a roadmap. Friends later shared that Rob often spoke about responsibility, not just as a parent, but as a human being. He believed deeply that abandoning someone you love was never an option. That belief guided his decisions, even when fear entered the picture. He didn't see his son as a threat. He saw him as a child in pain. And for many parents, that perspective is impossible to let go of, no matter how severe the circumstances become. Michelle's role in all of this cannot be overstated. Caregivers often carry invisible trauma of their own. Constant vigilance, emotional regulation, and crisis management become daily life. Over time, that kind of stress erodes a person quietly. There are no applause or headlines for holding a family together behind closed doors. Only exhaustion, only sacrifice, and often silence. As public attention slowly shifted to the legal process, another truth emerged. No verdict would ever bring closure. No sentence could undo what happened. No ruling could restore what was lost. The court case may determine Nick's future, but it cannot heal the past. For Romy, life will always be divided into what existed before that door opened and everything that followed. Experts in trauma psychology note that sudden loss combined with public scrutiny creates a unique kind of emotional burden. There is no private space to grieve. Pain becomes performance, whether the person wants it to or not. Romy didn't choose the spotlight, but it found her anyway. And yet, by all accounts, she has tried to face the aftermath with quiet strength, leaning on creativity, work, and trusted connections to survive what cannot be fixed. This story also forces society to confront a difficult question. When does compassion require limits? Love without boundaries can feel noble, but in some cases, it can unintentionally allow harm to grow. That doesn't make the love wrong. It makes the situation tragic. Parents are rarely equipped to draw lines when the cost might be losing their child altogether. And systems rarely step in early enough to help them do so safely. For Nick, the road ahead is uncertain. Whether he spends his life in a psychiatric facility, prison, or some combination of both, his future will be defined by a moment shaped by years of illness, addiction, and instability. That doesn't excuse what happened, but it does demand a deeper understanding of how these outcomes are created, not overnight, but over decades. What remains most heartbreaking is that this story contains no villains in the traditional sense. There is no simple explanation, no single mistake, no moment where everything clearly went wrong. Instead, there is a chain of human decisions made under fear, hope, exhaustion, and love. And that complexity is exactly what makes it so hard to accept. Rob Reiner spent his life exploring human imperfection through film, often reminding audiences that people are shaped by forces they don't always control. In a tragic twist of fate, his own family became a reflection of that truth. Fame didn't protect them, money didn't save them. Love, while abundant, wasn't enough, and maybe that's the hardest lesson of all. As this case continues, more details may emerge. Court documents will be filed, experts will argue, opinions will clash. But beyond all of that, one reality remains unchanged. A family was destroyed, not by lack of care, but by a storm no one could fully stop. If there is meaning to be found here, it may lie in awareness, in recognizing the warning signs earlier, in supporting caregivers before they burn out, in improving mental health systems before crisis turns into catastrophe, and in remembering that behind every tragic headline are people who loved deeply and tried desperately to do the right thing. If this story stayed with you, don't look away. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for Forever Fame TV. Because some stories aren't meant to be forgotten, they're meant to be understood.